So my dad and I were on an elevator, and I was remembering a conversation we'd had after he'd seen the Beatles on television. And he said that it was ridiculous, their haircuts were terrible, and their music was just noise, and he really disliked the crowds of screaming teenagers who seemed to follow them everywhere. We were in this elevator, and of course there was elevator music. And I thought I recognized the tune, and after a moment I said, "Dad, what do you think of this song?" And he said, "It's nice." He said, "It's melodic. I like it." I said, "It's the Beatles." He gave it just the right amount of pause, and then he said, "I bet the original sounded different." And of course it did, because, elevator music, it's as bland as it can possibly be. Whatever the original song was, it might have been a song that was a cry to action, and translated into elevator music, and it sounds just fine. And it doesn't call anyone to do anything. The principles that led to the American Revolution have a little bit of the same story as the way that the Beatles song my dad would have condemned when he heard them play it was something he found tuneful and pleasant when he heard it as elevator music. So, the principles that led to the American Revolution were revolutionary. It wasn't a metaphor back then. Yes, the ideas were revolutionary ideas. And those ideas led to an actual bloody and violent revolution. So today, let's see if we can get off the elevator for a few minutes to experience the power of those principles and the promises they make when they're not translated as elevator music. And it's not only the principles that were based in the founding of this country, it's also our Unitarian Universalist values, our 7 UU principles as well. Freedom of religion. James Madison was 22 years old, and he was writing frenetically to his friend William Bradford. He was writing about freedom of religion. He was so frustrated about the Baptists who were put in jail for being Baptists, for preaching Baptist theology. And in fact, during the period from 1768 to 1774, half the Baptist ministers in Virginia were put in jail. And, it wasn't just Virginia. People talk about how our country was founded with the idea of religious freedom, but actually a lot of the colonists who came over really wanted to impose their own idea of the way people should believe on anyone who lived in their territory. In Massachusetts, for example, under state law, the federal constitution didn't at that time apply to state law. Abner Neeland, a Universalist, was jailed in 1838 for his flagrantly heretical views in Massachusetts. Yeah. Seat of freedom, right? The Plymouth colony. And after he was released from prison, Neeland came to Iowa because he thought it was a place where he could really be free. Wow. And today, we know that even though we have the Constitution and we have the laws that support freedom of religion, it's amazing how many Jews and Muslims are persecuted, maybe not officially by the government, but still persecuted for their religion. And Native American traditions. Think about whether it's clear that Native American traditions are fully respected in our country today. there's still work to be done on this American Revolution. Let's look at the idea that all are created equal. All men is the original. And Thomas Jefferson, at the age of 30, was so excited by the idea of a continental Congress that would frame American demands to the king, that he actually wrote instructions to the Virginia delegates without being asked, and he wasn't a delegate. But you can imagine him there on his smartphone, right? Texting and posting and communicating in every possible way. It sort of would be the equivalent today of a blog, his instructions to the Virginia delegation. And in fact, his instructions were so good that they added him to the Virginia delegation. And he became the primary drafter of the Declaration of Independence. And he said, he wrote, all men are created equal. Now, of course, at the time, we were supposed to understand that the word men stood for all humans, but the slaves were intentionally left out. In fact, Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence criticized the king for allowing slavery, but that was taken. Native people were left out, women. So it wasn't just that men stands for humankind, it was actually that men stood for men and stood apparently for white men. And of course, the idea of civil marriage as a civil right wasn't even present in the culture at the time, and nor was the idea of people who are transgender and what rights they might or might not have in this new society that the Continental Congress was imagining. It is a revolution that happened so long ago that we've forgotten how much passion and energy and rhetoric went into claiming the rights of the people who were putting forth, really for the first time, this idea that people get to choose their government. That all people have certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Today, if we can get off that elevator for a minute and stop hearing the familiar resonance of the ripples from the American Revolution that were translated into elevator music in our generations of culture. The elevator music that says, yes, these are the principles of our nation. We can actually look at what some of the voices are saying today about what they need and what their rights are, what their rights should be if you look at the actual principle that all are created equal, that in Unitarian Universalist terms, that every person should be treated with respect because of each person's inherent worth and dignity. What does that mean when we're off the elevator and not just sort of swimming like a fish in the ocean of our assumptions? Well, for me, one of the new areas of learning has been, well, first the Black Lives Matter movement really opened up a whole vista to me. But then most recently, it's been an understanding of the importance of pronouns in my use of pronouns in talking with everyone, not just people who may use different pronouns because they are gender fluid or gender nonconforming. And it's been really hard. You know, my brain is on that elevator, and it doesn't want to say they when I'm talking about a single individual. It's amazing how I can know what someone wants me to say, what they prefer as pronouns, and the wrong words just come out of my mouth. So I'm trying to find ways to hold myself accountable for learning something new, for getting off the elevator of what has become habitual, and really not just hearing those new voices, but actually beginning to be an ally with them through changing how my own brain works. And it is not easy. The right to peaceably assemble was a major issue for the colonists who were writing to the king in the Declaration of Independence. It incorporates ideas like free speech and the right of the people to petition for grievances that made it into the Constitution. But the reason the right to peaceably assemble was important was the Boston Massacre, where the people were gathered to complain, to announce their grievances to the governor, and they were shot. Soldiers fired into the crowd indiscriminately, and many were killed. And that was a major flare-up. And the argument was that they were about to riot, and so deadly force was needed to quell the riot. That is a theme that we see repeated through history, when those in power wish to silence those who are demanding their rights. If we go back to 1670, William Penn, then only 26 years old, was the founder. He became the founder of Pennsylvania many years later. But at 26, he was a Quaker, and he had been invited to preach at the Quaker church. There was some preaching done then, apparently, amongst the Quakers, to preach at the Quaker church in Grace Church Street in London. But when the people arrived at the church, they found that the authorities had chained shut the doors of the church and they couldn't go in. William Penn, this is that young adult energy. He said, I'll preach from the steps. And he did. He preached to a crowd of Quakers standing in the street, listening to him, and he was arrested, not for preaching heretical views, which they were at the time. He was arrested for inciting a riot. Quakers. He was inciting Quakers to riot. That was the charge. And the authorities were so annoyed with William Penn and his eloquence that at the time, the right to trial by jury is another thing that's pretty foundational and didn't really exist then. There was a jury, but the prosecutor sat as a judge in the trial of William Penn, one of the judges, and the prosecutor sent the jury away to get a verdict. The jury came back and said that all he had done was preach in Grace Church Street. And they said, What do you mean? He incited a riot. And they said, no, he was preaching or speaking to people assembled, a crowd assembled in Grace Church Street. And we have good documentation of this story, even approved by the people who were the judges. The jury refused to convict him of inciting a riot, even after the judges sent them back to be without water or food, and to quote the prosecutor who was the chief judge, not so much as a chamber pot. William Penn, at age 26 in 1670, remembered that experience. And it illustrates how, in the Boston Massacre, again, there's a crowd of people, and maybe they're shouting a little bit. Maybe they are angry, but they are talking. They are not shooting, but they are shot. The government authorities shoot them. So in Ferguson, we also saw peaceful protesters rightly distressed about the death of Michael Brown, and they were met with a full militarized police response, and people were hurt, people were clubbed to the ground, people were injured and bleeding. And to me, that feels so much like the response of the authorities to the people, whether it's William Penn in 1670 or Boston in 1774. The revolution isn't done. So I should offer a quick contrast between what happened at Ferguson and my own arrest in front of the White House. I was with a group of people who were peacefully protesting the Iraq War. And we actually had the largest group of people ever arrested in front of the White House. And it was almost 200 people. And it was very peaceful. And the police gently put handcuffs on us, gently escorted us into the bus, and gently took us to where we could be processed and released with not even a fine. That's not what happened in Ferguson. And I can't help but think that the fact that I and just about everyone else in our group was white was a factor in the way we were treated. So the principle is that all people are equal. The principle in Unitarian Universalist terms is respect for the inherent worth of every person. And the promise is that every person means every person, that all means all. So on the elevator, it seems normal, it's right, it's ordinary, that slavery is illegal and people of color can vote. But there's more. If we get out of the elevator, we can hear a call for an end to voter suppression, an end to gerrymandering. Equity and justice in human relations. The revolution is not done. On the elevator, it seems normal for women to vote, so good. But off the elevator, women and people of color continue to lack representation in Congress in proportion to their presence in the population. That will be a different world when we start electing women and people of color. And I long for the day when people who are on the elevator think it's normal to have women making up half of Congress and people of color making up almost that much, because we're just about at 50% of people of color in this country. And one day it will be more than 50%, one day soon. I wish I could ride the elevator when it seems normal that Congress represents everyone. And what about immigrants of color and the racism that they're experiencing, the detentions and cruel treatment that they're experiencing? Where is Thomas Jefferson? Would he please pull out his smartphone and text those words again: life, liberty, happiness. And the idea, remember, isn't just U.S. citizens are entitled to those things. All people endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all. We still have a revolution to carry forward into the future. It's not done. But so often our brains are on the elevator and we miss what's happening in the world today. We miss what the 20-somethings are posting and tweeting and texting and blogging about. We miss the way that the voices of the people who now are claiming their rights are shuttered and silenced by claims that they're simply being violent and that there's a need for law and order. So the principle is that all of these basic ideas that were part of the American Revolution are the foundation of our country today. And the promise is that they will become reality. And if we listen now and don't wait until however many years it may take for those principles to become elevator music for some new generation of Americans, if we don't wait, but we listen so that we can honor the principles and promises of our own faith. But you know, we can't just do something. It's the song, Michael Jackson's song about the man in the mirror. You can't just do something. First, it starts here. It starts with getting off the elevator, getting our brains out of that elevator music place so that we can actually hear the voices. You know, the people who are blocking the street by lying down in a die-in, that's like the Boston Massacre. And maybe they're willing to put their lives at risk because they hope that a violent response will cause someone to notice what they need. They're fighting the American Revolution. And until they and we win, it isn't over. Until the promises of those principles bear fruit in the form of a just and humane nation, the revolution continues. Can those of us with privilege, 250 years after the American Revolution, get away from the elevator music that lulls us into complacency? If we struggle, we can. If we work at it, we can. If we hold ourselves accountable, we can. And then we'll hear the new voices. Then we'll hear the new songs that are built on the old songs, but they sing of something not yet come into being. Some of those voices arise from within this beloved church community. Others rise from our faith and the wider Unitarian Universalist world. They call us to join humanity's peace movement. They call us to continue the revolution.